He came to the mountains to outrun memories, but memories had longer legs. They were patient hunters, bred in the bone-dry crucible of the Afghan highlands, and they were not tired. John carried them in the spare architecture of his frame, in the disciplined quiet of his movements, and in the deep-set caution of his eyes. He was a man in his 40s, built of lean muscle and sinew that had been conditioned by years of service in a world that never made the papers. Now, his world was this: a rented cabin clinging to the edge of a vast, steel-gray lake in the Pacific Northwest, a fortress of solitude walled in by colossal firs, and a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. He wore the same things most days: a uniform of self-imposed exile, an olive M65 field jacket, its fabric softened by 1,000 washes and a few lifetimes of wear, a plaid flannel shirt, a pair of faded cargo pants, and leather boots that had molded to his feet. On his wrist, a military-issue watch kept time not by the hour, but by the metronome of his own rigid schedule. His only companion was not a pet, but a partner. Kaiser, a German shepherd of advanced years, was a veteran of the same shadowed battlefields. The dog's muzzle was a distinguished silver gray, and his amber eyes held a deep, knowing intelligence. He was never entirely off duty. He moved with the same quiet economy as John, his presence a steady, grounding weight in the vast emptiness of the wilderness. This was their treaty with the world: to be left alone, to walk the perimeter of the lake each morning, and to let the ghosts of the past wear themselves out against the indifference of stone and water. But his canine, on a day that began like any other, froze. His discovery would change everything, proving that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some duties can never be abandoned. Where are you watching from tonight? Let this story unfold, and perhaps in its telling, we can find a piece of our own quiet truth. The morning air was cold and clean, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and the vast metallic body of the lake. A thick mist clung to the surface of the water, erasing the far shore and swallowing the tops of the ancient trees that crowded the banks. It was a world of gray and green, muted and soft. John walked the familiar game trail that skirted the water's edge, his boots making little sound on the packed dirt. Beside him, Kaiser moved with a fluid, silent grace, his head up, his ears swiveling to catch the subtlest shifts in the atmosphere. He wasn't sniffing for squirrels or deer. He was assessing, measuring, reading the landscape with an instinct honed by years of sniffing out threats far more lethal. John felt the change before he saw it: a subtle stiffening in the dog's gait, a shift in the rhythm of his breathing. He stopped and watched as Kaiser's head came up, his nose testing the air. The dog's posture was a declaration. His body went rigid, a statue of focused intent, his gaze fixed not on the trail ahead, but up the steep, densely wooded slope to their right. There was nothing up there but a nearly impenetrable wall of old-growth forest, a vertical tangle of ferns, moss-choked logs, and trees the size of cathedral pillars. John's own senses went on high alert, a switch flipped by the dog's silent alarm. He scanned the forest, his eyes searching for the flicker of movement, the unnatural line, the patch of color that didn't belong. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the gentle lapping of the lake and the distant cry of a raven. Yet Kaiser remained locked, a low vibration humming in his chest, too deep to be a growl, more a physical manifestation of profound unease. "What is it, boy?" John's voice was a low murmur, not meant to break the silence so much as to become part of it. Kaiser didn't look at him. He took a hesitant step toward the slope, then another, his body a tightly coiled spring. He looked back at John, his intelligent eyes holding a clear question. This was different. This wasn't the scent of a bear or a cougar. This was the scent of wrongness, of an anomaly that disturbed the ancient order of the place. John trusted the dog's instinct more than he trusted his own eyes. He gave a short, sharp nod. That was all the permission Kaiser needed. The dog moved without a sound, vanishing into the thick undergrowth. John followed, his hand resting on the folding knife clipped to his pocket, a habit he couldn't shake. He pushed through wet ferns and low-hanging cedar boughs, the steepness of the incline forcing him to use his hands to pull himself up. The air grew thicker, heavier, the smell of decay more pronounced. He could hear Kaiser moving ahead of him, not with the frantic energy of a chase, but with a methodical purpose. After a climb of nearly 100 feet, he found the dog. Kaiser was at the base of a monstrous Douglas fir, a tree that must have been a sapling when Columbus sailed. He wasn't just sniffing now, he was digging, his powerful front paws sending clumps of dark, rich soil flying. John watched for a moment, his training kicking in. He scanned the area in a slow 360-degree arc. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate what had drawn the dog here. Easy, Kaiser, easy. The dog ignored him, his digging becoming more frantic. Then, John heard it. A dull clink, metal on claw. Kaiser stopped, whining softly, and began pawing more gently at the hole he'd excavated. John knelt beside him, the dampness of the ground seeping through the knee of his cargo pants. He reached into the hole, his fingers brushing against something cold and hard. It wasn't a rock. He cleared away the loose dirt and pine needles. What he uncovered was not a bone, not a root, but a length of braided steel cable, thick as his thumb, pitted with rust, but still fundamentally intact. It snaked out of the earth and disappeared again a few feet away. Marine-grade cable. He knew it instantly. What was it doing here, hundreds of feet above the lake, buried in the heart of the forest? He looked at Kaiser, who sat back on his haunches, panting softly, his work done. The dog looked from the cable to John, then back again, a clear expression of, "I told you so," in his amber eyes. John ran his gloved hand along the exposed section of cable. It was taut. It led somewhere. He stood up and sighted along its direction, deeper and higher into the woods. A sense of profound strangeness settled over him, a feeling that he had just snagged a thread on a tapestry he never knew existed. He gave Kaiser a firm pat on the head. "All right, boy," he said, his voice low. "Let's see where this goes." He began to follow the cable, using it as a handhold to pull himself up the increasingly treacherous slope. The forest floor was a chaotic jumble of fallen logs and moss-slicked boulders. Every step was a calculation. After another 50 yards, the cable rose out of the ground and was wrapped twice around the trunk of another enormous tree, the bark having grown around it, swallowing the metal over decades. From there, it stretched upwards, into the canopy, vanishing into a dense cluster of younger firs and hemlocks. He stopped, tilting his head back. And then he saw it. It wasn't something he processed all at once. His brain struggled to reconcile the image, to fit it into any logical context. High above him, wedged between the trunks of 3 ancient trees, was a shape. It was long and curved, a sweep of faded color that was not green or brown. It was the color of peeling paint, a ghostly white and a faint oxidized red. It was the hull of a boat. He stood frozen, his mind racing. A boat. Not just a dinghy, but a vessel of significant size, at least 30 feet long. It was suspended some 50 feet in the air, held fast in a cradle of living wood, draped in curtains of moss and vines as if the forest had tried to digest it. It rested at a slight angle, its bow pointing toward the lake it could no longer reach. It was an impossible object, a maritime ghost haunting a woodland cathedral. This was what Kaiser had sensed. Not a smell, but a presence. An immense, silent wrongness that had been weeping its metallic scent into the soil for half a century. John's heart, a muscle long accustomed to the steady rhythm of control, began to beat a little faster. The isolation he had so carefully constructed around himself had just been breached, not by a person, but by a derelict fishing trawler stranded in the sky. He had come here to be done with missions, but one had just found him. Getting up to it was a challenge. The trees that held it were too massive to climb directly. John circled the site, his eyes tracing potential routes. He found a smaller, leaning fir a few yards away that offered a path. Its branches were thick and sturdy, a natural ladder. He holstered the thought of risk, the internal voice that calculated odds, and began to climb. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had scaled far more than trees in his life. The bark was rough under his hands, the scent of pitch sharp in the air. As he climbed higher, the boat resolved into clearer detail. It was an old-style commercial trawler, with a small wheelhouse and a rounded fantail stern. The name on the bow was just visible under layers of grime and moss. The Albatross. A fitting name for a vessel so unnaturally airborne. He reached a thick branch that was level with the boat's gunwale, and swung himself across the gap, landing silently on the weathered deck. The wood was soft and spongy under his boots. A fine green dust of moss and pollen puffed up with each step. The silence up here was different, heavier. He was in a place that had been sealed away by time. He moved toward the wheelhouse, his steps slow and deliberate. The door was gone, leaving a dark, gaping doorway. He peered inside. The small cabin was a time capsule. A layer of dust and leaves covered everything. But it was not the scene of a violent wreck. Things were in their place. A small, pot-bellied stove stood bolted to the floor in one corner, a rusty stovepipe angled through the roof. A built-in wooden bunk had a rotted mattress on it. On a small fold-down table, a tin cup sat next to an overturned book, its pages fused into a solid, moldy brick. This was not just a crash site. This had been a home, a refuge. His eyes were drawn to the forward wall of the cabin. Pinned to a section of corkboard was a map. It was a nautical chart of the lake, its paper yellowed and brittle with age, the blue of the water faded to a pale ghost of itself. The map was dotted with depth markings and contour lines, but it was the single object still pinned to it that held John's attention. A small, red-headed pin. It wasn't placed randomly. It was pushed deliberately and firmly into a very specific spot on the chart, a location in the deepest part of the lake, a trench marked on the map as Callahan's Deep. John stared at the pin. It was a beacon, a declaration. It was the only spot of vibrant color in the entire grayscale world of the decaying cabin. It was a single, pointed question mark left behind by a long-gone occupant. Who had lived here? And why had they been watching that specific point in the lake with such intent? He pulled out his phone, the modern device feeling like an intrusion in this forgotten space. He carefully took several high-resolution photos of the map, zooming in on the pin and the surrounding depth soundings. He explored the rest of the small vessel. In the cramped galley, he found cans of food stacked neatly on a shelf, their labels long since dissolved into rust and paper pulp. He found a locker containing a foul weather jacket, stiff as board, and a pair of rotted rubber boots. Every detail pointed not to a frantic escape, but to a life being lived, a life that had simply stopped. The person had left the cup on the table, the pin in the map, and walked away. Or they had never had the chance. He felt a strange sense of reverence, of trespassing on hallowed ground. This was more than a curiosity. It was a story, and he had just read the first perplexing page. He backed out of the cabin, leaving everything as he had found it. As he prepared to climb down, his gaze fell upon the steel cable again. He saw now where it terminated. It was bolted directly to the boat's sturdy mast, the other end presumably anchored to the massive tree on the slope below. It hadn't been a mooring line for water. It had been a tether, a stay line, holding the boat fast against the pull of gravity and the push of the wind. Someone had intended for this boat to be here. They had secured it to the mountainside. He descended the tree, his mind a whirl of questions. When he reached the ground, Kaiser was waiting, sitting patiently, his tail giving a slow, single thump against the earth. John knelt and ran his hand over the dog's broad head. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew something was up here." Kaiser leaned into his touch, a quiet affirmation. They made their way back down the slope to the lakeside trail, the world of mist and water feeling suddenly different, thinner. The familiar landscape now seemed to hold a secret in its depths, a secret marked by a single red pin on a fading map, in a boat that had no business being in the sky. John felt the old instinct stirring within him, the part of him that pieced together puzzles, that followed threads, that saw a mission through to its end. He had tried to bury that man under a mountain of solitude, but the ghost of the albatross was calling him out. The drive to Port Coldwater took 40 minutes, a winding two-lane road that hugged the contours of the lake. The town was little more than a main street with a grocery store, a diner, a gas station, and a squat brick building that housed the county clerk's office, the sheriff's substation, and the library. It was a place that felt preserved in amber, a town that time had largely agreed to ignore. John parked his old pickup truck and walked toward the county building. Kaiser stayed in the truck bed, his head resting on his paws, watching John with an unwavering gaze. He knew the drill. Some places were not for him. The clerk's office smelled of old paper, floor wax, and weak coffee. A large wooden counter separated the public from a warren of filing cabinets and shelves groaning under the weight of heavy binders. Behind the counter sat a woman who seemed as much a fixture of the place as the wood paneling. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of reading glasses. A nameplate on the counter read, "Evelyn Reed, County Clerk." She looked up as he entered, her expression one of neutral appraisal. "Can I help you?" John approached the counter. He was used to being assessed, and he knew the impression he gave. Quiet, intense, a man who didn't belong. "I'm hoping to look at some old maps," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent room. "Survey maps. Of the lake. From before the dam was built." Evelyn Reed took off her glasses and let them hang from a chain around her neck. Her gaze was direct, curious. "The pre-inundation surveys? Those are archived. Not many people ask for those. What's your interest?" "Historical," he said, offering a half-truth. "I'm staying out at the old Miller cabin. Just curious about the history of the area." She considered him for a long moment. He didn't fidget or elaborate. He just stood and met her gaze. He had learned that the most effective way to deal with gatekeepers was with quiet, respectful patience. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. "All right," she said, pushing her chair back. "The large format plats are in the back. They're fragile. You'll need to handle them on the main layout table." She led him through a swinging gate into the archives. The air was even drier back here, the smell of paper more acute. She pulled a long, wide drawer from a massive flat file cabinet, and with practiced care, lifted out a rolled, yellow document tied with a faded red ribbon. She carried it to a large wooden table and untied the ribbon, gently unrolling the map. It was a beautifully hand-drawn topographical map from 1947. The detail was incredible. It showed the entire valley as it had once been, with the original river snaking through it. And there, in the center of the valley floor, was a small, gridded cluster of buildings, labeled in neat, cursive script. Havenwood. John leaned over the map, his eyes tracing the old riverbed, the forgotten roads, the outlines of homesteads that were now hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the lake. He pulled his phone from his pocket, brought up the picture of the chart from the boat, and compared the two. He found the area marked Callahan's Deep on the modern chart. On this old map, that exact location was the town square of Havenwood. The red pin was pushed through the heart of a town that no longer existed. Evelyn watched him, her curiosity piqued. "Find what you're looking for?" "Maybe," John said, pointing to the submerged town. "What happened to Havenwood?" "The dam," she said simply. "The West Pacific Power Company built the Rossman Dam in 48 and 49. Turned this whole valley into a reservoir. Progress, they called it. The families were bought out, relocated. Most of them, anyway. The town was supposed to be completely cleared before they started the flood." "Supposed to be?" John picked up on the careful phrasing. Evelyn sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of local lore. "There are stories that the final flood came sooner than expected. A 100-year storm, the company called it. Hit right at the end of construction. The water rose faster than anyone predicted. Some folks say not everyone got out." She tapped a finger on the map. "But that's just talk. The official record is clear. The town was empty." John looked from the old map to the photo on his phone. A boat, secured to the mountainside high above the current water line. A chart marking the center of the drowned town. It didn't add up. "This map is a geological survey?" "Topographical and geological, yes," Evelyn confirmed. "If you really want to get into the weeds on that, you'd need to talk to Arthur Vance. He was a surveyor for the USGS for 40 years, did his master's thesis on the geology of this very valley, knows more about what's under that lake than anyone alive." "Where can I find him?" "He lives in a small house just outside of town. Retired, mostly keeps to himself. Spends his days organizing his rock collection," she said, a hint of fondness in her voice. She wrote an address on a small slip of paper and pushed it across the counter. "You tell him Evelyn sent you. And be prepared to listen. Once you get Arthur started on geology, he doesn't stop." John thanked her, his mind already moving to the next piece of the puzzle. He felt her eyes on his back as he walked out. He had the feeling he'd be seeing Evelyn Reed again. Arthur Vance lived in a tidy cottage surrounded by meticulously organized gardens of rock. There were sections for igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic, all labeled with small, neat signs. The man himself was in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair, a pair of bright, inquisitive eyes, and hands stained with the dirt of his life's passion. He met John at the door, wiping his hands on a rag. "Evelyn called ahead," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly robust. "Said you were interested in the old valley. Come in, come in. Don't mind the clutter." The inside of the house was a museum of geology. Shelves were filled with rock samples, core drills, and framed topographical maps. John explained what he was looking for, carefully omitting the discovery of the boat. He framed his questions around the dam project and the 100-year storm Evelyn had mentioned. Arthur's eyes lit up. "Ah, the official story," he said, a wry smile playing on his lips. He led John to a large table covered with his own hand-drawn charts and overlays. "The West Pacific Power Company was in a hurry. Big government contracts. They cut corners. I've spent 30 years arguing that the storm was a convenient fiction." He pulled out a geological map, one far more detailed than the one at the clerk's office. He pointed to a series of fault lines and shaded areas indicating soil instability. "This whole north side of the valley was a glacial moraine, unstable. A mix of clay, gravel, and silt just waiting for the right conditions to let go. The company's own engineers warned them. I have copies of their reports. They said that clear-cutting the slopes and then saturating the ground by filling the reservoir too quickly could trigger a catastrophic landslide. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The official timeline says the storm hit, the river flooded, and the reservoir filled in 72 hours. I say that's impossible. What I believe happened, he continued, his voice dropping, is that they knew a slide was imminent. A slide would have buried half of Havenwood and exposed their negligence. So they initiated the flood themselves, opened the sluice gates prematurely, used the cover of a predictable autumn storm, and flooded the valley. They buried their problem under 200 feet of water, calling it an act of God. A cold knot formed in John's stomach. A deliberate flood. A cover-up. It explained the boat. Someone must have known what was coming. They had anchored their vessel high on the slope, above the projected new waterline, to wait it out. To watch. Would a flood like that be powerful enough to lift a boat and wedge it in the trees? John asked, keeping his tone casual. A 30-foot trawler? Absolutely, Arthur said without hesitation. A rapid inundation creates massive turbulence, surges, and whirlpools. It would have been a hydraulic nightmare in that valley. It could easily lift a boat, spin it around, and jam it anywhere. As the water settled to its final level, the boat would be left high and dry. I've seen it happen in other dam projects. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of corporate malfeasance on a deadly scale. But one piece was still missing, the personal one. The why. He thanked Arthur for his time, the old surveyor still excitedly explaining the properties of schist as John walked to the door. The drive back to the cabin was different. The lake was no longer a place of serene beauty. It was a crime scene. A tomb. The mist clinging to its surface seemed like a shroud. That evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, John went back. He and Kaiser made the climb to the Albatross again, this time with a purpose. He carried his Everly stock half-track pack, containing a pry bar and a good flashlight. He had a feeling the boat had one more secret to give up. Inside the cabin, he ran his hands along the floorboards, looking for anything out of place. Near the bunk, he found it. A single board whose nail heads were brighter than the others, whose edges were just slightly worn, as if from repeated removal. He inserted the tip of the pry bar and gently lifted. The board came up with a soft groan. Beneath it, nestled in the dark space, was a heavy, lead-lined box, the kind used to protect sensitive materials. It was sealed with two simple latches. His heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This was it, the heart of the secret. He lifted the box out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the table and, with a deep breath, unfastened the latches. Inside there was no treasure. There was something far more valuable. There were 3 reels of audio tape, their magnetic strips carefully wound, and a thick, leather-bound logbook. He opened the logbook. The inside cover had a name written in neat block letters. Thomas Corrigan. Below it, a date range. October 1949 to November 1949. The handwriting inside was meticulous, the entries precise and dated. It was a journal of quiet observation and mounting dread. Corrigan, a disgruntled engineer for West Pacific Power, had documented everything. He described anchoring his boat on the slope, his ark, as he called it. He detailed the company's deliberate suppression of the geological reports. He wrote of his attempts to warn the few remaining families in Havenwood, families who had refused to sell their land and were fighting the company in court. October 28th. Spoke to the Millers again. They won't leave. They believe the law will protect them. They don't understand the company is the law out here. November 5th. Security has increased at the dam. They're preparing. I overheard them talking about the coming weather front. It's a code. They're going to flood the valley before the injunction can be served. John flipped to the last few pages. The handwriting grew more urgent, more slanted. The final entry was dated November 12th, 1949. The rain has started, just as they planned. The river is rising, but not naturally. I can hear the roar from the dam even from up here. It's not a storm. It's a murder. I have the tapes. I recorded my conversations with Henderson, the project manager. It's all there. His admission. His threats. If I don't make it out, this is my testimony. The people of Havenwood deserve justice. Their names were... The entry ended there. The ink trailed off as if the pen had been dropped. Had the flood risen faster than even he expected? Had he tried to escape? John sat back, the weight of the logbook heavy in his hands. It was a complete narrative of a corporate crime, a massacre disguised as an accident. But it was the name, Thomas Corrigan, that sent a jolt through him, a shock of cold recognition that had nothing to do with 1949. He had seen that name before. It was in a file from a mission debrief years ago. An analyst, a quiet man who had worked in signals intelligence, a man who had raised concerns about faulty intel on a high-stakes operation in the Zabul province. An operation John had led. An operation that had gone disastrously wrong because of that intel. Corrigan had been the whistleblower. He had been discredited, pushed out, and then he had vanished. The official story was that he'd had a breakdown and walked away from his life. But John had always wondered. He looked at the name in the logbook again. It couldn't be a coincidence. The same man. A man whose life was a pattern of seeing the truth and trying to make others listen. He had tried in 1949, and he had tried again 50 years later, and both times, he had been silenced. This wasn't just a historical injustice anymore. It was personal. It was a debt. The ghost of Thomas Corrigan had just handed him a mission. A chance to finally give a voice to a man who had been silenced twice. The silence of the cabin pressed in, no longer empty, but filled with the weight of a 70-year-old promise. If this chapter stirred something in you, if the quiet courage of a lone man trying to right a wrong resonates with the faith you hold in your own heart, take a moment to reflect. So often, we are faced with our own quiet wildernesses, our own forgotten truths. The Lord doesn't always call us to grand pulpits. Sometimes, He asks us to simply climb a hill, open a dusty box, and listen to a story that needs to be told. If you believe in the power of bearing witness, in the quiet miracles of loyalty and truth, then like, share, and leave a comment below. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue to explore these stories of faith and fortitude together. Sometimes the Lord asks us to stay and listen. He carefully packed the logbook and the tapes into his backpack, cushioning them with a spare shirt. He felt a sense of immense responsibility settle over his shoulders, a weight that was familiar and, in a strange way, clarifying. For years he had been adrift. Now he had a heading. He had a duty, not to a flag or a command, but to the memory of a man he'd never met, but whose integrity was now intertwined with his own. As he and Kaiser descended the slope in the fading light, John's mind was already working, planning his next steps. The tapes needed to be heard. The logbook needed to be read by someone with authority. He thought of Evelyn Reed, her sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. She was the starting point. She was the institutional memory of this place. He reached his cabin as full darkness fell. The small structure, usually a haven of comforting quiet, felt different now. It felt exposed. He lit a single lamp, the low light casting long shadows. Kaiser, sensing the shift in his demeanor, didn't settle into his usual spot by the door. Instead, he lay down near John's feet, his body a warm, solid presence, his head on his paws, but his eyes open and alert. John sat at his small table, the contents of the lead-lined box laid out before him. He stared at the reels of tape. He had no way to play them, but he could imagine the voice on them. Corrigan's, tense and earnest. Henderson's, dismissive and threatening. Evidence. Proof. The kind of truth that powerful people would go to great lengths to keep buried. And the company, West Pacific Power, was now the Westward Legacy Foundation, a massive entity with deep pockets and a benign public image. They wouldn't want the story of Havenwood unearthed. The thought had barely solidified in his mind when he saw it. Headlights. A vehicle was coming down his long, private gravel driveway. No one ever came out here. Not delivery trucks, not locals, not ever. He instinctively moved to the window, peering through the darkness. A late-model SUV, expensive and clean, rolled to a stop 50 feet from his cabin. Kaiser was on his feet in an instant, a low rumble vibrating deep in his chest. He didn't bark. He was too disciplined for that. It was a warning meant only for John. "Easy," John said softly, placing a hand on the dog's back. The muscles there were tense as steel cables. The car door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had been purchased that afternoon. He wore a brand new Arc'teryx jacket and crisp, technical pants. He moved with a smooth, unhurried confidence. He paused by his vehicle, his hands in his pockets, and surveyed the cabin as if appraising a piece of property. Then, he started walking toward the front door. John moved away from the window, his body settling into a state of relaxed readiness he hadn't consciously accessed in years. Every sense was heightened. He could hear the crunch of the man's boots on the gravel, the whisper of his jacket fabric. He quickly and quietly slid the logbook and tapes back into his pack and pushed it under the table with his foot. A polite knock sounded at the door. Not the hesitant rap of a lost tourist, but the firm, confident knock of someone who expected the door to be opened. John waited a beat, then opened it. The man on his porch was of medium height, with a well-maintained, athletic build and a face that was pleasant and forgettable. His smile was easy, professional. "John?" he asked, his voice smooth and friendly. "John Caldwell?" John didn't answer the question. "You're on private property," he stated, his voice flat. The man's smile didn't falter. "My apologies. My name is Davies. I'm with the Westward Legacy Foundation. We own the surrounding land. I was hoping I could have a moment of your time." "It's late," John said, his hand resting on the doorframe, his body blocking the entrance. "It is," Davies agreed amiably. "But we're on a bit of a tight schedule. We're conducting a final environmental survey of the area before a land reclamation project begins next week. I was just reviewing the parcel maps and noticed your lease here. I wanted to touch base, make sure our work wouldn't disturb you." It was all perfectly reasonable, perfectly polite, and every word of it was a lie. John could feel it. Land reclamation project. The phrase was a smokescreen, bureaucratic language designed to obscure. "I haven't been disturbed," John said. Davies' eyes flickered past John into the sparely furnished cabin, then back to his face. "Good, good. Look, the reason I'm really here, it's a bit sensitive. Our survey teams have been working in the woods on the North Slope. They came across something unusual." He paused, his gaze sharp, probing. "An old wreck. A boat, of all things, wedged up in the trees. Have you seen it?" The question was delivered with casual curiosity, but it was a surgical strike. John's expression remained impassive. "It's a big forest." Davies chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "It is. But a boat in the trees tends to stand out. We believe it's been there since the dam was built. The thing is, a wreck that old can be a hazard. Leaching chemicals, unstable structure. According to our charter, we have a responsibility to remediate such sites. For the safety of the environment, of course. It needs to be professionally and discreetly removed." Discreetly. The word hung in the air between them. He wasn't talking about environmental safety. He was talking about removing evidence. He was here to find out what John knew. Throughout the exchange, Kaiser had remained just inside the doorway, out of Davies' direct line of sight. Now, the dog took a single, deliberate step forward, coming into view. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood, a silent, powerful monument of gray fur and honed muscle, his gaze locked on Davies. It was a posture of absolute judgment. A king observing a pretender to the throne. The low rumble in his chest was still there, a subsonic threat. Davies' eyes darted to the dog, and for the first time his polite mask slipped. A flicker of genuine apprehension crossed his face. He was a man used to controlling situations with words and money. He had no vocabulary for this kind of primal authority. He cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "That's quite a dog." "He's a good judge of character," John said, his voice cold. The pretense of friendliness evaporated. Davies' tone became brisk, all business. "Look, Mr. Caldwell, your lease here is month to month. The Foundation is prepared to offer you a generous sum to terminate it early. Say, 6 months' rent plus a moving stipend. For your cooperation. It would make our reclamation work much simpler if the area were unoccupied." It was a bribe, thinly veiled as a business transaction. He wanted John gone before the reclamation work, the destruction of the albatross, began. He wanted no witnesses. "I'm not interested," John said. Davies' jaw tightened. "The offer is substantial. It would be a shame to have to go through formal channels. Eviction notices, legal proceedings. It can all get so unpleasant. And public." The threat was no longer veiled. He was talking about scrutiny, about dragging John's isolated life into the light. "I'll take my chances," John said. He started to close the door. "Our work begins Monday morning, Caldwell," Davies said, his voice sharp. "The site will be secured. For your own safety, I'd advise you to stay away from the north slope." John closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, listening as Davies' footsteps retreated, as the car door slammed, as the engine started and the SUV drove away, its taillights swallowed by the oppressive darkness. He turned and looked at Kaiser. The dog was still standing at attention, his gaze fixed on the door. "He knows," John said, more to himself than to the dog. "Or he suspects." Kaiser finally relaxed his stance, walked over to John, and pushed his head firmly into his hand. It was an act of grounding, of reassurance. "I am here. We are here." John sank to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the coarse fur. The simple, solid reality of his partner was an anchor in a suddenly treacherous sea. The polite man in the expensive jacket had just declared war. The mission was no longer about uncovering a secret. It was now about protecting it. The next day was Sunday, a day of unsettling quiet. John spent the morning watching the lake. Just after dawn, he saw it, a low-slung barge with a heavy-duty crane mounted on its deck, moving slowly across the water from the direction of the dam. It anchored a few hundred yards offshore from the north slope.
A smaller launch began ferrying men and equipment from the barge to the shoreline. He could see Davies through his binoculars, directing the activity. They weren't waiting for Monday. They were moving now. A storm was also moving in. The sky to the west was a bruised purple, the clouds thick and heavy.
The wind was picking up, whipping the surface of the lake into a frenzy of whitecaps. The air had that electric, heavy feeling that comes before a major squall. The impending chaos in the weather felt like a mirror to the chaos Davies was bringing to his shore. John knew he had to act. He couldn't let them get to the boat. He couldn't let them erase Thomas Corrigan's testimony. He went to his phone and made a call. "Evelyn Reed." Her voice was as crisp as ever. "It's John Caldwell," he said. "The man who was looking at the maps." "I remember. There's a boat in the trees on the north slope, an old trawler called the Albatross. Inside it is a logbook and audio tapes documenting what really happened to Havenwood. The Westward Legacy Foundation is here now. They're setting up to destroy it." He spoke quickly, laying out the facts without emotion. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "A boat in the trees," she repeated, not with disbelief, but with the tone of someone fitting a wild new piece into a familiar puzzle. "I'll call the sheriff, but their jurisdiction on Foundation land is complicated. It could get tied up in court for days. Where are you?" "I'm going up there," John said. "I'm getting the evidence out." "Caldwell, don't," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "That man, Davies. His foundation has powerful lawyers. Don't put yourself in the middle of this." "It's too late for that," John said. "If I'm not back at my cabin by nightfall, or if you don't hear from me, send whoever you can. The boat is about 200 feet up the slope, due north from the big cove." "John." He ended the call. He looked at Kaiser, who was already standing by the door, his tail held low, his body tense. "Stay here," John commanded. It was an order he rarely gave. The dog whined, a low, pleading sound. "This is my risk, not yours. Stay. That's an order." Kaiser sat, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful protest, but he obeyed. The discipline of a lifetime was stronger than his desire to follow. John grabbed his pack, checked the contents one last time, and slipped out the door. He didn't take the trail. He moved through the woods, using the dense cover of the forest to stay hidden from the crew on the shore. The wind was howling now, tearing through the tops of the firs with a sound like a freight train. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy, began to fall. As he began the climb, he saw Davies' men starting their own ascent. There were 4 of them, dressed in climbing gear, stringing ropes. They were professionals. He had to beat them. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He scrambled up the familiar route, his movements sure and swift. He reached the clearing below the Albatross just as the full force of the storm hit. The rain came down in blinding sheets, and the wind bent the trees, making the whole forest groan and sway. He could hear the shouts of Davies' men below him, their progress slowed by the weather. He launched himself up the leaning fir, climbing with a desperate urgency. He swung onto the deck of the boat, which was slick with rain and pitching like a ship in a heavy sea as the trees that held it swayed violently. He had to get the evidence and go. He had the logbook and tapes in his pack already, but he remembered Corrigan's final unfinished sentence. He had to check if there was anything else. He ducked into the cabin, the wind shrieking through the open doorway. He turned on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. He went straight to the bunk where the logbook had been. He ran his hands under the rotted mattress, feeling for anything, a loose paper, another journal. Nothing. He checked the small compartments under the bunk. Empty. A tremendous crack echoed from outside, louder than the thunder that was now booming overhead. The entire boat lurched violently, throwing him against the wall. He scrambled back to the doorway and looked out. A massive branch from one of the supporting trees, weakened by age and battered by the wind, had snapped. It had crashed down onto the boat's stern, splintering the old wood. The vessel groaned, a sound of tortured metal and timber, and shifted in its cradle of branches, tilting at a more precarious angle. It wasn't going to hold for long. Below, he could see the headlamps of Davies' crew, much closer now. They were less than 100 feet away. He had to leave. As he turned to exit the cabin, his flashlight beam caught something on the floor that had been shaken loose by the impact. It was a small, flat tin box, the kind that used to hold tobacco. It must have been wedged in the bunk frame. He snatched it up and shoved it in his jacket pocket. He exited the cabin and prepared to descend. That's when he heard it, over the roar of the storm. A bark. A single, sharp, desperate bark. He looked down toward the trail at the base of the slope. It was Kaiser. The dog had disobeyed. He had followed. And he was in trouble. A section of the rain-saturated slope, already unstable, had given way in a miniature landslide of mud and rock. Kaiser was caught in it. A heavy, waterlogged log had slid down and pinned his hind leg. The dog was crying out now, a sound of pain and fear that cut through John like a knife. John froze. His mind, a cold, calculating machine, presented the options with brutal clarity. 1. Descend the far side of the trees, use the storm as cover to escape. He had the evidence. The mission was paramount. Get the story out. Avenge Corrigan. That was the logical choice. The operator's choice. 2. Go down to the dog. Risk capture by Davies' men, who were closing in fast. Risk losing the evidence, failing the mission. The memory he had tried so hard to outrun rose up, no longer a ghost, but a visceral, suffocating reality. The dust and smoke of Zabul. The shouting in a language he barely understood. The face of the local informant, a young man who had trusted him, pinned down by enemy fire. The order had come over the radio. Extract now. Leave him. John had argued for a split second, then complied. Mission first. He had made the cold calculation. He had left the man to die. He had never forgiven himself for that choice, for the sound of his own footsteps running away. He looked from the headlamps ascending the hill to the struggling form of his partner below. Kaiser, who had stood by him through the years of silent torment. Kaiser, who had disobeyed a direct order not out of defiance, but out of loyalty. The choice was not a choice at all. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned his back on the escape route. He dropped his pack, the precious evidence inside, into the relative shelter of the boat's cabin. He couldn't risk it being damaged. He would come back for it. He pulled his folding knife from his pocket, its blade clicking open with a sharp, decisive sound. He began to descend toward his dog. He was not running away this time. He was choosing to stay. He moved with a controlled recklessness, half climbing, half sliding down the muddy slope. The rain was a physical blow, the wind trying to tear him from his holds. He reached Kaiser, who was whimpering, his leg trapped at an unnatural angle under the heavy log. "I'm here, boy," John said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. "I'm here. I've got you." He began to work, trying to find purchase on the slick log, trying to heave it. It was too heavy, too embedded in the mud. He needed leverage. He looked around wildly and saw a stout, broken branch a few feet away. As he lunged for it, a beam of light hit him in the face, blinding him. "Don't move!" a voice shouted over the storm. One of Davies' men stood 10 feet away, braced against a tree. He was younger than the others, his face tense.
He wore a faded olive-drab jacket, an old piece of Army-issue gear. He saw the scene, the man, the injured dog, the desperate struggle. John ignored him. He grabbed the branch and jammed it under the log, trying to create a lever. He put all his weight on it. The log shifted, but not enough. "I said don't move," the man repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at John's face, illuminated in the beam of his own headlamp. He saw the raw determination there, the absolute focus. He saw a man trying to save his partner. Then, the man's gaze flickered down to John's wrist. The military watch, its face scratched and worn, was unmistakable to another soldier.
He looked from the watch to John's face, to the disciplined economy of his movements, even in desperation. He saw a fellow veteran. "Sir?" he called into the radio on his shoulder. His voice was strained. "Sir, the slope is giving way up here. It's unstable. The whole thing could go. It's too dangerous to proceed. We have to pull back." A tinny, angry voice crackled back, lost in the wind. The young man didn't wait for a reply. "We're pulling back!" he shouted to the other climbers below him. He looked at John one last time, a flicker of understanding, of shared loyalty passing between them. Then, he turned and began to retreat down the slope. He had made his choice. At that exact moment, a brilliant red flare shot into the night sky from the far side of the cove, its light painting the storm clouds in a ghastly, beautiful light. Evelyn Reed. She had listened. She had acted. The flare was followed by the sound of a powerful engine. A boat with a flashing blue light was cutting through the storm-tossed water, heading directly for the shore below them. The sheriff. Witnesses. Authority. John gave one more desperate heave on his makeshift lever. The log shifted, just enough. He pulled Kaiser's leg free. The dog yelped but immediately began licking his hand. John didn't waste a second. He scooped the large dog into his arms, a feat of pure adrenaline, and began the treacherous journey back down to the trail. His mission changed from one of evidence to one of rescue. The story in his pack could wait. His partner could not. The morning after was eerily calm. The storm had passed, scrubbing the air clean. A gentle sun was burning the last of the mist off the lake, turning the water to a placid sheet of silver. The north slope was cordoned off with yellow tape. A sheriff's deputy stood guard at the trailhead. The boat from the sheriff's department was moored at the small dock near John's cabin. John sat on his front step, the warmth of the sun feeling like a benediction. Beside him, Kaiser lay with his head on John's lap. His back leg was wrapped in a clean white bandage, a splint holding it straight. The vet from Port Coldwater had come out at dawn. A clean break, he'd said. He would heal. John gently stroked the dog's head, his fingers tracing the line of the noble gray muzzle. The terror of the previous night felt like a distant dream. After he'd carried Kaiser back to the cabin, he'd seen Davies' crew hastily packing up their gear on the shore, their operations scuttled by the arrival of the law. He had gone back up the slope in the pre-dawn light and retrieved his pack from the cabin of the Albatross. The logbook and tapes were safe. He had handed them over to Sheriff Miller, a stout, quiet man whose face gave nothing away. A car crunched on the gravel driveway. It wasn't a sheriff's vehicle. It was a modest sedan he recognized. His sister, Sarah, got out. He hadn't spoken to her in 6 months. She lived in Seattle, a world away from his self-imposed exile. He hadn't called her. Evelyn must have. She walked over and stood before him, her arms crossed. She looked at him, at the exhaustion etched on his face, at the calm in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. She looked at the bandaged dog, then back at him. He braced himself for the lecture, for the "I told you so," for the questions about the past that he never wanted to answer. Instead, she held out a large cardboard cup from a coffee chain.
"I brought you a real coffee," she said, her voice soft. "Figured you were probably sick of whatever you brew out here." He took the cup. His hand trembled slightly. "Thanks," he managed to say. The word felt inadequate. She sat down on the step next to him, leaving a small, respectful space between them. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the lake.
It wasn't the uncomfortable silence they had shared for years, filled with unspoken accusations and grief. It was a new silence, a peaceful one. It was the beginning of a bridge being rebuilt, not with grand apologies, but with a simple cup of coffee and a shared, quiet morning. Later that day, Evelyn Reed came by with Sheriff Miller. They told him the Westward Legacy Foundation's lawyers were already filing injunctions, but it was too late. The State Historical Preservation Society and the Attorney General's office had been notified. The story of Havenwood was out. The tapes had been sent to a forensics lab to be restored and digitized. Davies had been detained for questioning after trying to interfere with the sheriff's deputies. "The logbook," Evelyn said, her voice holding a note of awe. Thomas Corrigan. He became something of a local legend, the man who tried to warn everyone. No one knew what happened to him, and to think he was the same man who... Later on. She trailed off, looking at John. She knew. She had put the pieces together. "He deserved for his story to be told," John said quietly. Sheriff Miller nodded, his gaze steady. "The state is going to need someone to help the historians and divers, someone who knows the terrain, knows the story, someone they can trust to stay on site and make sure everything is handled right." He wasn't asking a question. He was making an offer, a new mission. John looked out at the lake, at the placid water that covered so many secrets. He had come here to disappear, to be a ghost. But the ghosts of this place had called him back to the world of the living. They had given him a purpose beyond his own pain. He looked at Kaiser, who lifted his head and met his gaze, his tail giving a weak but steady thump on the wooden porch. "I'll stay," John said. Months passed. The autumn gold gave way to the stark white of winter and then melted into the vibrant green of spring. The story of the Havenwood cover-up became a statewide scandal, then a national one. The Westward Legacy Foundation was dismantled under the weight of lawsuits and federal indictments. A memorial was planned for the families who had been lost, their names finally read into the public record from the last pages of the small tin box John had found, where Corrigan had hastily scrawled them before he was forced to flee. John stayed. He worked with the team of divers and historians, using Corrigan's meticulous charts and his own intimate knowledge of the landscape to help map the submerged town. He became a guardian of the place, a keeper of its memory. His sister visited on weekends. They talked, not about Afghanistan, but about the future, about the garden she was planting, about the new puppy she was thinking of getting. They were small steps, but they were all in the right direction. One clear, calm afternoon, he took a small boat out onto the lake, Kaiser at his side. The dog's leg had healed perfectly, leaving him with nothing more than a slight, dignified limp. John cut the engine when they reached the spot that had been marked by the red pin. The water was so still it was like a pane of dark glass. He looked down into the depths, but he no longer saw a tomb. He saw a story that was now being told, a truth that had finally surfaced. He thought of Thomas Corrigan, the quiet man who chose integrity twice and was silenced twice, until a veteran dog smelled injustice on the wind. He thought of the choice he had made in the storm, the moment he had turned his back on the mission to save his friend. It was the choice that had saved him, too. It had broken the spell of the past, proving that the man he was now was not defined by the man he had been then. Kaiser rested his heavy head on John's knee, letting out a soft sigh of contentment.
The silence that filled the vast space around them was no longer an enemy to be outrun. It was not an absence. It was a presence. It was the earned peace that comes after a long and worthy fight. The mountain wasn't holding its breath in judgment anymore. It was just breathing, steady and slow. And for the first time in a long time, so was John. What you have just witnessed is a story of quiet miracles. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on distant fields, but in the silent wilderness of a single human heart. The world may not have seen John Caldwell's choice on that stormy hillside, but heaven did.
God's work is often like that. A quiet nudge from a loyal friend, a flare in the dark at just the right moment, the strength to turn back when everything tells you to run. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, of a choice that haunts your quiet moments, know this. Redemption is not always a lightning strike. Sometimes it is the slow, steady work of choosing loyalty over logic, of choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. It is the second chance that arrives not as a pardon, but as a new and unexpected duty. There is a strength that comes from staying. There is a grace that is found in protecting the vulnerable, in speaking for those who have been silenced. May you find the courage to listen for the quiet truths in your own life, and the faith to act when they are revealed to you. May God bless you and keep you. May He give you the peace you have earned and the loyalty of a friend who will follow you into any storm. If this story of a second chance found in the wilderness has touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Comment below with your own stories of quiet miracles, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to build this community of faith together.